Ukrainian tanks roll through Red Square in Moscow to the roar of their engines. Yellow and blue aviation soars over the Kremlin, and Russia's new democratic government signs a treaty to renounce their nuclear weapons. Or how else is this war supposed to end? The scenario we have just presented looks quite picturesque, but how plausible is it? Unlike Hollywood blockbusters, the real-world denouement of conflict is not often rosy, but it is always dramatic. Keep watching to see what our prediction is for the resolution of this conflict. Just hurry, this video may suddenly evaporate if our guesses don't pan out. Before we ponder the future, let's look at the present. Ukraine is paying a huge price for stopping the Russian war machine on its soil, and while the infrastructure can be rebuilt, human lives cannot be restored. For many experts, the course of this battle was unexpected. Ukraine was predicted to lose quickly, but in the first days, the country managed to withstand Russia with little to no help from the West and managed to fight back. Oil depots in Belgorod burned, the Russian airport in Millerovo was on fire, and Moscow was in flames. Only the cruisers so far. But these are episodes. Most of fighting is taking place on Ukrainian territory, taking the lives of more and more Ukrainian military and civilians, depleting the country's resources. Under such conditions, the state becomes hostage to an increasing number of circumstances. For example, the role of foreign support and loans is increasing markedly. Morale and the will to win are important. But let's start with the economy. According to a May review, the Center for Economic Strategy, with an ongoing stalemate on the battlefields, the GDP decline forecast did not change much and varied from 30% to 40% under the assumption that the Russian occupied territories would not expand, and the hot war will last several months. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky stated that Russia has fired more than 3,000 missiles at Ukraine since the start of the conflict. How many of them were shot down and how many hit the target? It is not known, but it is almost impossible for industry to operate under such conditions. This is especially true of the military sector. Let's take into account that the vast majority of Ukrainian exports were made precisely through Ukrainian ports, which are now blockaded by Russian troops. Supplies in this case fall on the shoulders of Western partners, which makes Ukraine dependent on support. But what about Russia? In the wake of its invasion of Ukraine, Russia has become the most sanctioned country in the world. Restrictions affect the country's military-industrial complex, economy, politicians, and media. We will not elaborate on each industry, but instead talk about the most important ones, about restrictions on the sale of Russian energy. For many years, Russia has supplied one of the richest markets in the world, Europe, with energy. The European Union is 1/5 of the world economy and is almost completely dependent on energy imports. Even in 2014, during the annexation of Crimea, the EU did not begin to refuse Russian supplies. On the contrary, the project to build a new pipeline bypassing Ukraine, Nord Stream 2, continued to develop. Indeed, after all, what could have gone wrong?
August night and the leaves hanging down and the grass on the ground smelling.
Here, there are some English journalists to see you.
Come here.
Sorry, so how will you command the Russian occupation of Crimea?
Come on, it's just post-COVID squabbles. Verstehen Sie?
Yeah, but what about the war in Donbass that is raging on in Ukraine now?
It's just straining. They're just post-Soviet states, that's how they sort things out.
But there are so many Russian equipment in the Ukrainian borders.
Come on.
Tonight, Ukraine's president addressing the people of his country just a short time ago, warning that Russian troops are moving into the capital, closing in on Kiev, saying that they could storm the capital.
In total, by February 24, the Russian Federation controls more than 40% of the European gas market, But what now? The EU is less keen to impose sanctions on Russian gas because it relies on it for about 40% of its gas needs. True, not everything is so clear. Now Europe is actively reducing dependence on Russian energy carriers. For example, in June 2022, the Council of European Union adopted a six package of sanctions that, among others, prohibit the purchase, import or transfer of crude oil and certain petroleum products from Russia to the EU. An extensive discussion is unfolding in the EU countries about alternative supplies, but even now the trend toward a reduction in Russian economic influence is obvious. Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki said even now Russia is no longer able to blackmail us in the way it blackmails Germany, for example. Money loves peace, and by declaring war, Russia proved its unreliability as an economic partner. Now, the arrival of other supplies on the market is only a matter of time. The EU is already negotiating alternative supplies with Asian countries.
Kassym-Jomart Tokayev has emphasized Kazakhstan's readiness to use its hydrocarbon potential to stabilize the situation in the world and European markets. Moreover, the European Union signed a new gas deal with Azerbaijan in May as officials scramble to secure future supplies amid growing fears about the Russian cutoff. According to the Commission, gas supply from the country will increase from 8.1 billion cubic meters in 2021 to an expected 12 billion cubic meters this year.
The result is a gradual loss of the largest market for Russian energy carriers. The loss of the EU market will lead to catastrophic changes in Russia itself. It will not work to replace Europe just with Asia. The places there are already occupied, and it will be possible to compete with other suppliers only due to price dumping, which is often not so profitable. The exchange rate of the ruble and the main part of the financial resources of the war comes from energy trade. The economy of the Russian Federation is not diversified, and if this flow is cut off, then there will be nothing to replace it with. Now, the Russian economy looks more stable, but this will not be a problem if Western support continues until the end of the war. Moreover, the main flow of funding for the Russian invasion will inevitably decline. Thus, the economic prospects are so far in the hands of Ukraine. But this trend requires constant support and participation. So, now let's talk about military perspective. With the assessment of military power is more difficult. The army is not just the numbers of divisions. It is motivation, supplies and morale. The real indicator for the strength of the parties can only be the front line. And during this war, it changed very rapidly. Ukraine's armed forces have shown that they can successfully resist Russia. If it wasn't, this video wouldn't exist actually. Now we are in conditions of uncertainty. Combat operations depend on too many factors, and it is impossible to predict them thoroughly. However, the army is led by politicians, and in a democracy, the people stand above all of them. After the unprovoked Russian invasion, Ukrainian public opinion is dominated by the desire not to compromise with the aggressor and to win back the territories of their country. Therefore, we dare to assume that there will be a Ukrainian counteroffensive. How successful? Time will tell. But compromise is not exacted in the future. What then? When will the war end then? The exit to the borders on February 24, the encirclement of Russian troops, and even the liberation of Crimea, which was actually occupied back in 2014, will not end this war. Why? The Russian-Ukraine war is an asymmetric conflict against a nuclear state. Even with a colossal advantage in conventional weapons, Ukraine will not be able to reach Moscow and hoist its flag over the Kremlin because of the threat of a nuclear war. But there are also pluses. For the defending side, it's enough to repel the attack and it has already won. For the attacking side, there is no other way to victory except to complete the campaign objectives. That is why the Kremlin is so desperate in prolonging war and changing goals day by day. The higher you get, the harder you fall. Losing the Russian Federation will try to prolong this conflict. Keep a good mind with is not the best game. Raise the stakes, but don't be fooled. I'm afraid to imagine how many more lives they will need to put in order to understand the futility of the situation. But even fighting against such a monster as Russia, Ukraine can influence the end of this conflict, and not only through diplomacy with the aggressor. War is always about instability and emotions, even in such rotten dictatorship as the Russian Federation, and every day of the war society is changing. Death as a result of wars is simply the tip of the iceberg. Other consequences besides death are not well documented. They include endemic poverty, malnutrition, disability, economic, social decline, and psychosocial illnesses, to mention only a few. What death will lead to a demonstration? What limitation will make the next oligarch sink? What drop will break the back of a camel? It remains unknown, but the war will rage until one side reaches a boiling point. Sanctions are intensifying. Russian resources are weakening, Western military assistance to Ukraine is growing. Along with this, a counter-offensive is approaching. What does the Kremlin hope for in this scenario? And the Kremlin is counting on you, dear viewer. Surprised? Now everything is in order. The Kremlin has one significant advantage over the European countries, and it lies in the fact that the Russian Federation is not a democracy, but a dictatorship. The time will come and the courage will weaken. With it, the support of the West will decrease. The rejection of energy carriers will lead to inevitable changes in the industry, lower the well-being of citizens. This will create a demand for changes, and there will be a party that will be ready to satisfy this request. Perhaps it will not be even pro-Russian. It will simply proclaim, for example, a reduction of participation in foreign policy. It will begin to reduce assistance to Ukraine. It will begin to agitate for negotiations with the aggressor. As the British say, cold pudding will settle your love.
Your order, sir.
Oi, mate! Why is this blood cold?
Rush just got off gas supply.
Take this of me! The dictatorship is better prepared for such challenges. The mouthpieces of propaganda will respond to the call to stop the war, and the army of security forces will respond to actions. The request of the people will definitely not reach the parliament. And Putin believes that in the long term, Western society will get tired of the war, and he will be able to deal with Ukraine one-on-one. But that won't happen. That is why we are here, so that this war does not suddenly become an Eastern Front without change. Death does not become a routine, and the significance of your support does not seem ineffective. Let's do it together. As always, thanks for watching, like, comment, stay strong, donate the Ukrainian Armed Forces. See you next week.